preceptor as well. And fun fact, full circle, Matt was one of my very first students here on campus with men's soccer. So, yeah, we know. And so was John, in case you didn't think about that. But we started off on a wonderful foot, and I've been happy to watch him grow and become an amazing athletic trainer since. So he's going to talk to you today about some psychosocial aspects of rehabilitation, and I was really honored when he asked me to be one of his advisors. So I'll let him get to it.
All right. As Sam was kind of introduced, my name is Madison. I'm a senior here at Springfield College, and the title of my presentation is "Do Cavities Really Make a Clinician?" So just a quick outline. My study is looking at the psychosocial aspect of clinician dress and clinician participation on adherence effects in student athletes going through rehabilitation. So just a quick outline of how my presentation is going to go. I'm going to start with my introduction, where I'm going to talk about the findings of the literature, kind of why I chose this topic, any key terms I need to define. Then we're going to move on to the purpose section, which is where I will outline the hypothesis and the research question of my study. The methods section, where I will talk about the outline of my study, the participants, as well as the experimental design. We will go into data analysis, which will be the results, the meat, the potatoes of everything, and then discussion, which will just kind of flesh out everything we talk about. So why this topic? I chose this topic because, as the athletic trainer students and the parents may or may not know, during your senior year at Springfield College, you have to do a rotation working rehabilitation plan. And one of the things that, if you haven't learned yet, they will drill into your head at this campus is we're a very big proponent of something called evidence-based practice. It's a three-pronged approach to healthcare that takes into account patient preference, clinician experience, and the latest research to provide the best quality of health that we can. And I've always been a very inquisitive kind of guy. I like asking questions. I always ask, why do we do this? Why do we do things the way we do? And I started thinking, is this really the right way? I was starting to think about how in a physical therapy, a personal training session, the person who is performing the service is dressed in more athletic wear. They're wearing basketball shorts, maybe a dry fit t-shirt, as opposed to your traditional rehabilitation clinician who's going to be wearing khakis, maybe nice slacks with either a dress shirt or a polo. And I wanted to see if we switched clothing, if we were able to facilitate a type of groupthink, to have social ecology to be able to increase adherence rates. So some quick key terms before I get any farther. Rehabilitation adherence. There is no set definition for rehabilitation adherence, at least as far as the literature that I can found that's widely agreed upon by everyone. So this is the definition I took from Quest, Gill, and Abenale. Rehabilitation adherence is an active, voluntary, collaborative involvement of the patient in a mutually acceptable course of behavior to produce a desired preventative or therapeutic effect. Basically, a patient needs to be showing up, actively involved, and trying to make themselves better. Clinician is any physician or other qualified persons who is involved in the treatment or observation of a living patient. And functional outcomes, which is something I'll refer to later, are just any positive benefits as a result of following the rehabilitation plan, such as increased range of motion, so ability to move the extremity, muscular strength, and proprioceptive function, which is just the body's ability to locate itself in space and know where it is. Key literature. I wanted to start out small, and in the athletic training world, some of the main articles that we use for anything we do are position statements and consensus statements. Unfortunately for me, that would be way too easy if there was a position statement on adherence rates. So the closest thing I could find was an NATA consensus statement on psychological concerns. The consensus statement looks into the recognition and referral of, English I speak it, patients who are suffering from a psychological concern or a psychological episode. So it's very important to look for signs of these things, such as rapid weight loss, rapid weight gain, changes in eating, fatigue, irritation, things that just allow the clinician to see that something's up with the patients. More research. Quest also found that patient long-term outcomes have been positively related to adherence rates. It's a positive correlation, which those of you who don't know what that means is, the better a patient adheres to rehabilitation, the better they show up, the better their outcomes, meaning they tend to have more range of motion, they tend to have better muscular strength, they tend to have a lower risk of re-injury. And poor adherence as a result has also been shown to decrease rehabilitation outcomes and increase risk for re-injury. Other factors of adherence, there are intrinsic factors such as self-motivation, patient belief in the efficacy of the treatment, patient belief in the efficacy of the clinician. Fatigue, additional stressors in life and family, and extrinsic factors are things such as convenience of scheduling, class schedules if you're a student athlete, other things that may take you away from the rehabilitation So, more research. To really facilitate this change, you have to learn a little bit about social psychology and how people work in groups. So the first thing I want to talk about is social facilitation, which is the idea that people do simple tasks better in a group. So if you're playing basketball, for example, and let's just say you're shooting by yourself and you can't get anything. One of your friends comes over, for whatever reason, there's an unconscious desire to do better when we're perceived in a group. So when you're in that group setting, you have a tendency to shoot better, have a higher percentage of shots, do better. Also going along with that is something called the Kohler effect, which is a small subset of social facilitation. The Kohler effect is the idea that no one wants to be perceived as the weakest member of the group. When someone perceives themselves as the weakest member of the group, they have a notable increase in motivation and exertional effort put into a simple task. So if you're looking at the picture I have up here, in a group setting, both participants are going to be trying to compete with each other to try to be perceived as the strongest member of the group. If someone perceives themselves as weaker, for example, let's say the woman in the pink decided that, oh, the girl next to me is doing a lot better. She's able to get 10 ball slams as opposed to 8 in the 30 seconds. So the girl in the pink would be much more likely to increase her effort, increase her motivation, and really try to work that extra, 5% to do better. So I'm going to switch over to a little video that I feel demonstrates social facilitation very well. I want you to look very closely at what you see and be asking me a question after the video. Would someone like to raise their hand and tell me, what did you see in the video? What did you see as a result of when the basketball player had his friend show up and started shooting around? Yes.
got a lot better.
He did get a lot better. He got a lot better with an audience. That is a very good example of social facilitation. All right, so going into the actual point of why I'm having this presentation and why I did this study in the first place, the purpose of my study was to look at the effect of clinician dress and participation on patient adherence. My research question is what would the effect of clinician dress and participation be on patient adherence, and my hypothesis was there would be a significant increase in patient adherence as a result of the change in clinician dress and participation. So starting off with my method section, I had 20 participants originally chosen for the study, 16 males and 4 females. They were aged 19 to 22 with an average age of 20 and a half years old. We unfortunately had that one participant drop due to a time conflict. He was still an in-season athlete. He had a lot of games that were far away during his rehabilitation slots, so he had to travel, so unfortunately we were unable to use his data entries. The only inclusion criteria was that there needed to be a valid 4-week script from a physician asking for rehabilitation from the Springfield College Rehabilitation Center. There was no exclusion criteria. Non-adherence for the group as a whole over the 4-week experimental window was 21.1%. And there was no independent grouping, blinding, or randomized groups. The overall procedure for the experimental design, before I did any of the informed consent ready participants, I had to first go through the Springfield College International Review Board, which is an organization that goes through Springfield College that kind of oversees all the research. You have to submit a review of literature, any measurement tools you're going to be using, basically outline your entire experiment study, and they go over it to make sure it's ethical, you're not going to be harming any participants, and everything's up to code. Following that, before that I also had to send an email to the head of the coordinator of athletic injuries rehabilitation at the university that I did the study at. I had to send him a letter asking for permission to use his participants. Following that, all participants were approached via community sampling. They were all patients in the clinic, so we went in, talked to them, asked them if they'd like to be involved in the study. It was explained to them. They were given an informed consent form to sign, legally explaining what was going on. Following that, we went into the actual experimentation. There was 2 phases. There was the control phase and the experimental phase. So the entire experiment took a process of 4 weeks. The control window was weeks 1 and 2, which consisted of the clinicians who were doing the rehabilitation dressed in traditional professional wear. So slacks, khakis, a polo. And we're told to stay relatively normal with the rehabilitation. What we didn't want is we didn't want the clinicians to change the way they're acting to try to help the sample, or not help the sample, help the results, help with the participation. Following the baseline, we gave out 2 surveys, which I will talk about a little later, and then we moved on into the experimental phase. The experimental phase consisted of the same 2-week period, so weeks 3 and 4, but we switched all the clinicians into more athletic wear, basketball shorts, a dry fit t-shirt, and we instructed them to try and have a little bit more of a participation with their patients. So if a patient, for example, was doing a jump training protocol, maybe, for example, doing some of the exercises with them while they're resting. There was no specific rules or guidelines that we set for the clinicians. We did send them a script of an example of how to communicate with the patient to be in line with what we wanted. But as far as that, we let the clinicians kind of have free reign to do their normal rehabilitation. We didn't want to change how they did their traditional way. We only wanted to change how they dressed and how they were involved. And then following all that, we did the data analysis. So the experimental tools used, we used 2 surveys that were validated, and we used an additional survey for our own use. The first survey we used was the Rehabilitation Adherence Measure for Athletic Training, also known as the RADMAT. The RADMAT is a 16-question survey scale with a 1 to 4 Likert scale. So if you go to the next slide real quick, we can kind of see the 1 to 4 Likert scale simply means on a scale of 1 to 4, rate this patient on this idea. So the first question is attendance scheduled rehabilitation sessions, and the clinician would then write down a 1 through a 4. The range of values for this survey tool is 16 through 64. And as I said earlier, Grant Quest found in 2010 that it was a statistically reliable measure of athletic training adherence and was designed specifically for athletic trainers to use. The Sport Injury Rehabilitation Adherence Scale, or the SARS, was also used. It's only a 5-question scale with 3 questions on a 5-point Likert scale. and that was given to the patients, not the clinician, the patients at the end of every rehabilitation session for week 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the rad mat was given at the end of week 2, and at the end of experimental week 1, so week 3, and the end of experimental week 2, so week 4. There was also an additional survey that was developed with the assistance of another researcher, which will be referred to as question 4 and 5. This survey merely looked at what was the patient's preference on clinician attire and what was the patient's preference on clinician participation. Showed that. So again, baseline weeks 1 and 2. There were 5 sessions with clinician and quote-unquote professional clothing, as I mentioned earlier. We gave 2 different surveys. The rad mat was given at the end of week 2, and that was given to the clinician specifically, and the series was given at the end of each session, and that was given to patients. The experimental phase, same basic time frame, 5 sessions with the clinician in traditionally athletic wear. They were given the same 3 surveys with the addition of the additional surveys. So again, the rad mat at the end of week 3 and 4, the series at the end of each session, and the additional surveys. So data analysis and results. All the data was run using IBM SPSS version 21 for Windows. All the data was screened for accuracy. We used descriptive statistics for the actual adherence rates off the rad mat, and we also used inferential statistics to judge any correlation between clinician dress, clinician participation, and adherence, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And there was no significant difference found between the variables and how we're doing the tables and all the fun stuff. So this first table is the descriptive status of the adherence rates. So just a quick explanation, quick notes, experimental 1, or E1 is the week 3, so the survey given at the end of week 3, and E2 is the survey given at the end of week 4. As we can see, the mean does have a drop-off of about 4 points between the control and the experimental 1, but by experimental week 2, window 2, we're back up to the exact same value. This next chart just shows participant preference on clinician attire. An interesting note that came out of the study, there was not a single participant who actually chose to have the clinician in a more professional attire. There were 5 people that chose athletic wear, and again, 14 people that said preference. So now we're going to start getting into some of the more inferential statistics that we ran. All the inferential statistics run using a mixed 2x2 ANOVA, which is just a statistical tool used to see if there's any correlation between 2 different variables. I know there's a lot of numbers on here. The only significant part that matters for us is, for my study, I set my alpha level. An alpha level is just a statistical term that means the mathematical probability that anything that happened was due to random chance. What I mean when I set it at 0.05 means that there's only a 5% chance statistically that my study and the results that we saw were a result of random chance, not intentional. So in order to meet that, I need to have a p-value that is lower than 0.05. As we can clearly see, I did not do that, so there's no statistical significance found between patient preference on clinician clothing. And this is just a cool little chart that shows it all off. The blue line, for those of you that can't see in the back, are the participants who chose athletic wear as their preference, and their correlated rad mat scores on the left. Whereas the green line is the participants who chose no preference, and the 1, 2, 3 are simply the 3 times I gave out the rad mat. Control window, experimental 1, experimental 2. As you can clearly see, there's a fairly decent drop-off in the no preference adherence scores. However, it goes all the way back up to the baseline value by experimental window 2. What we think happened with this study is that the participants who chose no preference for their preference might not have been necessarily as mentally involved or physically committed to rehabilitation. If they can't even come up with a preference for their clinician, they may not be that involved in rehabilitation, so that might be why there's such a sharp drop-off, or it could be random chance, hard to tell. The next chart is the same mixed 2x2 ANOVA run again, but this time it's comparing adherence rates to participant preference on clinician participation. Again, same thing, alpha level set at 0.05, and we did not find significance. And another grid chart. As we can see, the blue line is the people who chose exercise with as their participation choice. The very brown line that's a little difficult to see is the no preference line, and the green is the advised line. We thought it was interesting how there was a drop-off with the advised and the no preference, especially with the advised, because while there was a drop-off after they had told us that they did not like being advised as well, It still went back up to baseline values by the end of the second experimental. Interesting note, as well with no preference. So some of the limitations of the study. It was a small sample size, we only had 19 participants to work with. It would have been more ideal to have more. There's a very small difference between the measurements. So on the RADMAT score, our scores may have been varying from about 52 to about 59. And it was such a small sample size, that small difference in numbers is very hard to determine significance. If we had a larger sample size, we may have seen greater significance. Clinician workout plans are also another part of the study we're going to talk about in discussions. Certain injuries and certain rehabilitations work a lot better in this style of rehabilitation. Clinician's expectation for adherence. Something I didn't realize when I was originally planning this study is that due to this being a class for the seniors in the program, the patients are highly encouraged to attend. They have their coaches telling them to come in, they have the athletic training staff telling them to come in. So there is a larger expectation for adherence and to actually show up for rehabilitation as opposed to the general population. So that's a limitation as well. As I mentioned earlier, there was lack of blinding, and one last little note, there was no overall group meeting with all clinicians to go over how to actually fill out these surveys. It was handed to each individual clinician and explained at the time. We had a little bit of confusion with how to fill out the surveys between a couple of different patients. That could have been something we could have changed, just to make it a little bit clearer for some of the clinicians. So discussion. So there was no significance, so what? What does this actually mean? Well, adherence is an extremely important concern for athletes working to return to sport. We need our patients to adhere to rehabilitation. We want them to improve, we want them to return to sport, and we want them to succeed. So we need to figure out things that we can do to help us. We don't necessarily need to find things that work for everyone, but we need to find tools that we can utilize to help our patients. So the fact that we had fairly consistent scores when comparing first and last scores between when the clinician was in clothing that was professional and clothing that was more athletic, I think that means that we can actually utilize these clinicians in the athletic wear to be able to facilitate the group and to be able to facilitate that social psychology, to be able to motivate the athletes to do better. And again, one of the things we looked at was the difference between clinician clothing versus participation. Going back to all the data, I think the clothing kind of led into the participation. I think the participation is a bigger influence on the actual rehabilitation, because with the ability to participate, it allows the clinician to better demonstrate how to perform certain functional movements. When you can demonstrate how to perform functional movement well, the patients do better. When the patients do functional movements better, they get better. If you're teaching them improper techniques, that can lead to musculoskeletal imbalances, that can lead to a high risk of re-injury, and those are all things we try not to do. Application. So like I said, this might be beneficial on a case-by-case basis. So for someone like an ACL, where you're doing larger, gross functional movement patterns like, jump protocols, return to run protocols, things that you can do in a group setting work very well for this style of rehabilitation. Some of the smaller stuff, so if you had to rehabilitate, maybe you had a baseball player who broke their thumb. If they're doing small stuff like, grip strength with the grip wheel, they're playing with the Play-Doh, those are all small, fine motor skill things that are not necessarily as well in a group setting. So again, it's a very case-by-case. And anecdotally, we had clinicians and patients that all told us they like this. One of the patients says, it gives me something to compare myself to. Most of our population is very athletic driven, and most athletes, as we all know, are extremely competitive. They want to win, they want to compete. So giving them something to compare themselves to, giving them one more functional thing to compare themselves to push themselves to do better, I think is a very good thing. And someone else said it just makes the time go faster. It feels like I'm having more fun. It feels like I'm exercising with someone, not just being told to do something. Future research. Further research is needed. As I said, I would have a larger sample size. I would use a different participation group, so I would get more of a general population, so it would be applied to more of a wider group of people. The group explanation of the administration of the surveys, I feel, would be advantageous to clear any confusions. And number of clinicians, I think it would have been better if the study could have been done with only one rehabilitation clinician to try to cut down on any differences between just actual adherence style or rehabilitation. Sorry, just rehabilitation styles. Rehabilitation. Any questions? Yes.
Do you think if setting the athlete aside for a second, would find anything significant if you looked at clinician dress and their participation, like effects on how the clinician is dressed and their ability to participate? I think that'd be worthwhile at all.
I think it would be worthwhile study just to have it statistically. I personally believe that you would see a much better view of participation if you change clinician dress, because, you know, how many of us have been trying to, you know, pick up something, pick up a cooler, water, wearing khaki pants, a belt, and a polo. It's not the easiest thing, whereas if you are, you know, shorts and a t-shirt, it's much easier. You know, helping the patient with modalities, doing a jump program with your patients. I wouldn't want to do a jump program in something like this. So.
Yes. What other, you went through the literature, what other factors influence the performance of this population?
In this population, there's also the expectation to perform. So if a patient has a very high sense that they need to get back, they need to be able to participate in the team, they need to get back, you know, a star quarterback, for example, is going to be very motivated to go to rehabilitation. Whereas if it's someone who just had a season-ending injury and they have the next 8 months to do nothing and get in shape, their adherence rates are going to be horrible because they're going to be dealing with the fact that they're done for the year. If they were a starter, they're going to have to deal with the loss of athletic identity, which can cause all kinds of fundamental stuff. So overall, I feel the sport nature, the team nature, the fact that we're trying to compete and bring a team together does affect adherence rates.
Within your subjects, was it across a variety of sports?
Yes, there's a variety of sports, variety of positions. We had baseball, track and field, lacrosse, volleyball, wrestling, and swimming and diving. And starters, non-starters, all different positions.
In season and out of season?
In season and out of season as well. Yes?
In your research, did you see anything that the clinician was actually happier wearing athletic attire than like khakis? Because I know when I go to work in shorts and a t-shirt, I'm a lot happier.
There was no research that I found. Anecdotally, I had the same thing. Almost every clinician looked at me and said, this was so much better. I liked being able to move. I liked the freedom. I liked the clothing. Just about all of them told that. Yes?
Do you think from an athlete's perspective that dressing down the athletic trainer could affect how seriously they're taken as a clinician, and that could affect participation sort of in a negative way?
I feel like it depends on the athlete's perception of the athletic trainer to start with. If the patient knows the athletic trainer is qualified, is good to be able to treat them, and is knowledgeable in their thing, I don't think it really matters necessarily what they're wearing, as long as the patient believes that the athletic trainer knows what they're doing.
Could the uniform be changed to athletic shorts and a t-shirt?
That would have to depend on the clinic site, that would depend on here to there. Personally, I don't see any reason it couldn't, short of the appearance of professionalism. That's the only real issue I see with changing. Yes?
Do you think it would change based on, you talked about different locations, where here we have rehab in the morning and then do treatments and go out to practice and cover games. In other settings, like Division I, people are going to treat all day long and not necessarily have the same model that we do. How do you think that would affect your results?
Personally, I feel like our setup now would work a little bit better because if you're in rehabilitation in the morning, you could have the athletic trainer in that athletic wear for the functional movements, but then when it came time for game, cage practices, they could get back to khakis and the polo for the sake of professionalism for the game, so you could have the best of both worlds. If you were working all day in the clinic, you could, but I feel you run into the issue of, let's say you're treating patients all day and you gotta go out to a game, that's one more thing you have to do. One time you have to now set up for the game, change for the game, be presentable for the game on top of everything else you already have to do. So I think in certain settings it works better.
Are there other attire models beside the two that you use that maybe on extremes of dressed up more or dressed less that we could have weaved into a future study?
There are definitely, one of the things that we do with the athletic wear is we try to keep it as professional as possible. So we used to list it as shorts needed to be of sufficient length. There needed to be sleeves on all the shirts, no tank tops. Obviously you have to wear closed-toed shoes, all that kind of stuff. It would have been interesting to see that. I think that would be a good spot for future research to see that if you did have someone in a tank top and shorts and things that were even more casual per se, if that would have an effect on that. Versus having a guy in a full, three-piece suit during rehabilitation. He's going to look like he knows what he's doing, but is he actually be able to do anything? Is he able to help move with the patient? God forbid you have to help someone with active assisted range of motion wearing a three-piece suit.
As a clinical takeaway, what I'm hearing you say is the relationship that the athletic trainer builds with the athlete and the perceived confidence, less to do with maybe their attire within the models you looked at.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to hit on earlier when I was talking about kind of the application. I think more of the clothing was what facilitated the participation, which causes the change, as opposed to the clothing itself actually causing the change.